Okay, we should get going. So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Jeff Morrison, CEO and co-founder of Locust Walk. I want to thank you for taking the time to attend this panel. It's an important discussion for all of us in the life science industry and something very important to me personally. While I'm a big supporter of the careers of many women who are actually even attending this webinar, I recognize that I'm also not the best person to lead this discussion. As such, I asked my friend and Locust Walk Advisory Board member, Laurie Halloran, who's president and CEO of Halloran Consulting, to host the panel. Laurie did an amazing job. In less than 24 hours, she had the panelists already lined up and excited to share insights with the community. The response to our outreach has been overwhelming, and as such, we're going to be recording this so those who could not attend will be able to hear the content. So I can't wait to hear what you all have to say, and I don't want to delay any further, so without further ado, I'll pass the mic to Laurie to introduce this topic and her panelists who have invaluable insight and experience, and I will exit stage right. So Laurie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'll just set the stage here, and then I'll introduce you to our guests who all have incredibly interesting and different perspectives. In 2020, Bio did a survey in January 2020 to better understand the current demographics of bio companies. Responses to their questions on representation indicate that the number of women decreases at higher levels, no surprise. They found that at an average company in 2019, 46% of the total employees are women, 28% of the executive team are women, and only 16% of the CEOs of the companies in the survey are female. The board members have gone from 15 to 19% over the past few years. A lot of people think that that has been started by the mandate in California. But these numbers really indicate that there's a lot more work to be done. Women holding leadership positions on board is positively associated with other women directors having longer board tenures. Recognizing the value of gender diverse boards, institutional investors are starting to vote against all men boards in US companies. Although there's no shortage of female-led biotech companies, why do women still make up less than 20% of biopharma boards? That's what we're here to talk about today. And I immediately thought of these three women when I was asked to host this panel, because a lot of times women are asked, have you been on a board before? And if so, how do you get on a board? We know that once you're actively doing the work, you're suddenly being sought for additional positions. But how do you get into that club? And when you do you still continue to face roadblocks? So today I have Laura Brege, Managing Director of Cervantes Life Science Partners, Halley Gilbert, COO and CBO of Adagio Therapeutics, and Jodie Morrison, CEO of Cadent Therapeutics. We're going to explore some key themes here: common challenges women face trying to get on that first board, our panelists' insight and context behind these challenges, and then some ways to get ready, networking opportunities with the right people, and then, if we can get to it, the downside of the biotechs we'll probably face at maintaining the status quo. So first, I'd like to ask each of you to just introduce yourself with a high-level list of the boards that you are on. And since Halley just turned herself off for a minute, okay, we'll start with Laura.
Okay, I'll go for alphabetical with Brege. Thank goodness for that. I'm Laura Brege. I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much. I'm currently on 4 public boards, all in the biotech industry. Acadia, about 5 billion, Pacira, Mirum, and then a Canadian company called HLS, which has been pretty interesting as well, having a non-US board. It's my second non-US board. My career has been a finance and strategy career, and I've done tech, venture, and biotech, so I've got a pretty broad range of looking at the world.
Excellent. Halley, we'll go alphabetical.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to be here, Laurie. So Halley Gilbert, I'm CEO and CBO of a company called Adagio Therapeutics. It's a brand new company that started back in June. I am on 1 private company board right now in the allergy space, and then I'm also serving on 3 public company boards. One is a preclinical company, another one is mid-stage clinical, and the other is approaching commercialization. So all very different and diverse experiences. I chaired 2 of their nom and gov committees, and I sit on the audit committees of all 3 of them.
Okay, great. And Jodie.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Jodie Morrison. I'm glad to be here today. I am a biotech CEO. I'm a 3rd-time biotech CEO. and have been in the industry about 20 years, straight through biotech the whole time. I've been on numerous boards. So I was on the Carix board before becoming the acting CEO there, and then the Akebia board subsequent to our transaction. I was CEO and a board member at Tokai, and then subsequent to the merger, a board member at Novus. I was an independent and am an independent board member at Halloran, and I'm an independent board member at Ribon. So I've had both private and public board experience.
Excellent. What's interesting is that you all have very different backgrounds. You have different positions. It's going to be open season for questions for most of the rest of this. What do you see as the background that was identified for your key board appointments? And I will ask anybody who wants to join first with that.
Well, I'll start. As I said, I had a finance and strategy background, and I ran a P&L. And so fundamentally, people were looking for on boards, have you run something? Have you been responsible for things? Know how to deliver to the bottom line and know how to get money. So those were the expertise they were looking for before there's a concept of hiring women.
Okay.
I think for me, it was that having been a CEO and having taken a company public, right? I think that's really where my outside board experience came in. And my first independent board was certainly based on that. So having a seated CEO on boards is something we often look for, so that the CEO of the company has somebody they can commiserate with. So I often come in from that perspective, as well as sort of mentorship for new CEOs.
Mm-hmm. And Halley?
Yeah, I mean, I think so my background is a little different than the rest. So I come from sort of a functional, a technical expertise background in as a lawyer. So and I don't think lawyers are very popular on boards. So it really wasn't about that. It was more about a set of experiences that I've had over the past 25 years. Where I was able to start with smaller biotech companies in rapid growth phases and actually help see those companies through all of those different transformations. So from private to public, or R&D stage to commercial, seeing those evolutions in a biotech company's history is extremely valuable experience. And I think that was really more of the rationale for bringing me on the board than my actual day job.
Okay. It sounds like all of you have, for someone who isn't on a board and hasn't been on a board, it sounds like it's a mountain to climb to get there. But let's think about what you wish you knew that beforehand, that you now know about what you should think about, what the process should be before you get on a board, especially your first one. Halley, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to really understanding what your value proposition is for a board. So, I think a lot of women especially have these incredibly technical, functional expertise. And understanding that functional expertise, while it's incredibly valuable, and I'm sure folks are amazing at their technical jobs, that expertise will enable you to add value in probably 0.5% of every board meeting. And you need to be able to have a broader enterprise lens on a business to actually be a good board member. So I think to the extent that folks can take themselves, think about their experience differently, and not just their technically functional experience, and think about the broader set of experiences that they have as enterprise leaders in their companies, I think that will help them formulate a board proposition and maybe sort of have a hook to get board seats, because not all of us fit into the usual category of board members like audit committee, financial experts, or sitting CEOs. So those of us who don't fall into those accepted board criteria need to think more creatively about the experiences we bring to the table.
Okay, that's great.
I think that's totally on target, because it's a different job being a board member. And so when I think about, you have to think about, what are you bringing to the table? What's the role? How will you add value? Which is different than this is my function. And so part of that is to make that pitch, just as if you're looking for a new functional role.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think having exposure in the boardroom helps you see that, right? When you see the board and how it's functioning, and you can pick out the good board members and the bad board members, right? In any boardroom you're in. And I think understanding the broad expertise and the broad strategic advice that's required and part of the role of a board, right? it's really important to make sure you figure out where you fit in that, because it isn't, to Halley's point, it's not about your functional expertise. I mean, I came up through the clinical lens, so I can be really beneficial in those discussions, but that's not my job as a board member. It's to think about the broader strategic direction of a company. And that's really something you need to make sure you've had exposure to. So I think one of the things you really want to do is try to get yourself in that boardroom as much as possible. And if you're not in closed sessions, have communications with people that are, and understand what's happening there as well, because that will be a function of your role on a board as well.
But you don't.
And private's different than public. That's the other thing to be very thoughtful about. It's very different.
True. Very true.
You don't often get that view until you are a board member, unless you make extra effort to try to get a view within your own company. Yeah. Did any of you try to do that? And if so, how did you get that door to open?
Well, so at Tokai, which would be the first board I was part of, I originally was COO of the company, so I was not a board member. But I was responsible for the whole board deck. I was responsible for giving a lot of the board deck. We were a small company, and I was running clinical at the same time. So it gave me a lot of airtime with the board. When I eventually took over as CEO, it was a very smooth transition from that perspective. But I often try to, as a CEO, make sure that I get exposure for members of my leadership team so that they are in the boardroom for as much as possible. And then I try to debrief with them after about things that went well, didn't go well, discussions that, you know, are relevant and appropriate of executive sessions, so that they get a bird's eye view of that as well, as much as I can. Easier in a private company than a public company sometimes, though.
That was very similar to me. I started as a CFO and then was COO. And so you're naturally putting together much of the presentation, and you're in the room for a fair bit of it. And then figuring out who will talk to you. And I was very thoughtful. I always thought about sharing that with my team. Mm-hmm. When you say this, they hear that. Therefore, what do we want to communicate? And how did that go?
Great.
So showing them that you have 19 slides for 2 points is not helpful.
Right.
Exactly.
Excellent. When you got there, did you feel as though your presence as a board member, or how did you feel it was received by the other directors if you were the first woman? What learning can you pass along for others to pay attention to there?
I can start. My first outside board is probably the place to start. So I can say when I started on the Cervantes board, I was the only woman and remained the only woman through the transaction with Akebia. And then there were 3 of us. So that was kind of cool for a period of time. But I was the only one on there. And I didn't feel, there was a larger shift afoot at Cervantes when I joined. So I think there were about 4 of us that joined around the same time. So that might have kind of nullified any male-female transitions as a result of that. But I never felt different at the table. I'm still good friends with a lot of those board members. And I think if you can own your experience and own your strategic lens, then I think people look at you through that. That's been my experience.
I was the first female board member on 90% of the boards that I've been on. And I would say the exact same thing, even though I had a different way to get in there than Jodie was describing. It was just, this is my role, this is my job. It didn't feel that different than coming up through my career, to tell you the truth. I started in the tech industry, so I think I had a pretty aggressive approach to things in terms of, if I'm adding value, of course I belong here.
Yeah.
So I love my my colleagues' confidence. I wish I could say I was that confident in my first boardroom role. You hear a lot about imposter syndrome. Oh my God, did I feel that walking into that room? And that was that was on me. No one made me feel that way. That was just a mental hurdle that I had to get through. And, I think I did that through just relationship building at the board level. And just over time, you just get more comfortable. And after that first board position, I don't think I felt that anymore. Huh. It was real.
I think that's a really important point, though. I just want to focus on for a second the kind of ownership of taking it on yourself when you have that imposter syndrome. And I think it's important we don't conflate that with male-female dynamics in a boardroom. I think that's a first-time board member phenomenon versus a male-female thing. And I think it's just a really important point.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. If there were leading edge warning signs ahead of I actually want to talk about the situations where it hasn't been so easy. It's all sounded like it's pretty easy, but we all know that we've all heard about the things that happen in boardrooms that are really difficult and or dysfunctional. What kinds of things have you dealt with, and how have you dealt with them? And no names.
Well, I can start with a very publicly known phenomenon. So I've mentioned that I think there were 4 of us that joined the Carix board right around the same time. And within a month, 2 months, we had a stock out of a drug on the market and had to pull off the market. So that was an interesting time. First outside board, right? First commercial stage company. And so we had to work through that as a board. And so the situation didn't go well for the company, but I think the board did a phenomenal job of helping the company manage through that. I think it's an example of a time where, although our job is to sit above sort of the day-to-day and do the strategic alignment for the company, there are opportunities in moments like that where board members with deep expertise can get involved and try to help the company with the direction. And that's what we saw happen with those of us that had that kind of development stage experience, CMC experience. We were able to become more involved, and then we had to pull back up once we got it back on the market and things were back, moving forward in a positive way. But I think it is an opportunity for that flex. But we did not break down as a board during that challenging time. But it does speak to the importance of doing diligence, right? Here are 4 of us that came in. There were indicators in the slides I saw. I remember looking at them thinking, running pretty tight on inventory. It was there. And so I think all of us looked at it, all of us sort of knew there was this, but didn't dig into it perhaps as deeply as we could have. I'm not sure any of us wouldn't have joined over it, but I do think doing your proper diligence and knowing the risks you're taking on as a board member, just like you would in, taking on an employment role, is really important.
Laurie, you've dealt with
well, I've had 2. I had one where I messed up and one where it actually worked out pretty well. We had a CEO transition, which actually went very well. We had to make a change. It's a very hard conversation. You care about the people, you care about the company. Then we needed to step in a small team to run the company for a little while till you get a CEO. Not fun. And then step back out, just as you're describing, to that's not your job anymore.
Yeah.
And the board really held together beautifully during. It's an experienced board. We did very well. Another situation where I didn't do enough due diligence, as you're describing, I'm sure it was knowable if I had done more work, where after 2 meetings, I'm like, I need out of here. I need off this board. I can't actually get off this board though, because there's so many indicators for when you leave. So in order to do that, I had to see first, can I change things? Then recruit other board members and then come out. But it took 3 years, right? If you take the philosophy, which I do, is you can't leave when the company's having trouble. It's a non-starter. You can't add to the problem. So that taught me that I should have done a lot. By definition, they were selling to me when they were getting me on the board, and I took the bait. I didn't pay enough attention. After that, I've gotten a lot better.
So what would be a leading edge sign that people who don't know, I mean, in hindsight is 2020 for sure. What's a leading edge sign that they're selling to you?
Where everybody's telling you the same story, right? That's a good one for as you go through, where when you poke a little bit and everybody has sort of the same answer. It's like listening to an investor relations presentation with the same answer. This is probably a script that you guys have worked on. So I did wind up with one. I didn't go on this board. I wound up with a great board interaction where I was being interviewed. Loved the company, thought it was interesting. And then one rogue board member said to me, the science guy is just a terrific guy. I remember I'm supposed to be nice to you because we're not so sure that we're going to keep the CEO and you could help us. Like, good.
Yeah.
And then I said, why don't you share with me a little bit about your research? Because that works like a charm. Then he talked for the rest of the half hour. I called the chairman and said, 2 problems, not for me. And you guys probably get this figured out with the CEO first. It's a suggestion.
Okay.
So, but it was interesting.
But I think that is a leading indicator to watch for. That I think the involvement of the CEO in the search, how much they have ownership of the search, is something to look for. It should be a joint effort, right? If it is a board-driven effort, and in particular for people perhaps like Laura and myself, if they seem to be board-driven looking at you as a potential replacement, I've had to have those direct conversations of, I'm very interested in this board, but if you think that I'm going to step into that role, that's not what I'm here for. I'm here as a board member. I have a full-time job, or even if you don't have a full-time job, you got to be really clear about that up front if you have the skills to take that role and they're looking for a replacement.
Okay. Halley, any warning signs you would have seen in any of the?
Well, I guess I was gonna, I'll share maybe one of the worst case scenarios that you can go through as a board member, which I had in my first board role. So I joined, my first board was a company called Cadent out on the West
Oh,
Coast,
sure.
and phenomenal company with a great product. And I joined them when they were doing incredibly well. And within a year, we were looking at a bankruptcy filing. So, you know, that is not an experience I think you ever want to have as a board member, especially as a first-time board member, and going through the crisis management around that kind of situation. I was worrying about things that I never thought I'd worry about, like, wow, should my house be in my name? You know, do I need extra insurance? Will D&O policies cover me or not? So I think you need to really be sober to the fact that when things are going great with the board, that's great, but inevitably something goes wrong, and it's your job to be there and help them through that situation, whether or not there are personal and professional implications of doing that. It is a real commitment, and it's scary at times. That was a very scary experience.
Which leads us into what happens when there's a crisis. Define anatomy of change of the role for a board member in crisis. You just did that for you, Halley. Any other examples?
You're going to spend a lot more time. That's the first thing you do.
Yeah.
You'll spend a lot more time. There'll be tons of meetings, and it's not clear that it'll be a short-term problem. So it will take you some. You have to be very.
Definition, like what's a lot more time? Because I'm actually actively interviewing or being sought after for board.
So if you think about I think about a public company. You know, public company meets 4 times a year, and then you have your committee work and the whole bit. Here you'd be meeting every day, every other day, maybe, and almost always on the weekend, because that's the most time you can get everybody sit and go through here. So you may go from, I would say, maybe a 20% of your time to 40% of your time immediately.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. What do you think, Jodie?
Yeah, no, I think it depends on the crisis, right? It really depends on the crisis, the time commitment you're going to make. But I do think that there's an important aspect of the commitment that you're making, and not just, as Halley pointed out, for the sort of legal implications, in particular on public boards that you're taking on. So be smart about that if you take a public board, and do your homework as far as things like your house and insurance, and make sure you look at the D&O insurance on all companies you join. But in a crisis moment, it is your responsibility to find that time to step in. And so not overboarding yourself is a really important thing, in particular in your early days, because once you get a first board, then the sky is sort of open, and there's lots of opportunities once you've shown you're a good board member. But being a good board member is the point, right? It should be a long-term commitment to the organization you're going to, and making sure you can do that well and put the time commitment in good times and in bad is really important. So I do limit myself to 2 outside boards. I've done 3, it was too much. 2 works well for me when I'm a seated CEO. So I would be careful on that commitment of time, because you do need to flex if there's something that comes up.
Okay. What did you each do to get boardroom ready? There's a lot of people thinking that they need to go to a class.
Well, you know my opinion on this, Laurie. I'm not a fan of the classes, and I'm very public about this. I think classes in general about board readiness would be great. A lot of them are board readiness for women, and I personally take offense to that. I think there's the need to be board ready for all of us, but I don't think there's a special sauce for women. And I actually think suggesting that there is a negative in the long-term scheme of things. But I think that really getting boardroom ready does mean that exposure point, understanding the obligations of your responsibility as a board. Those are critical parts of it. Can you learn that in a classroom? Sure. But it's really the practical experience in the room at any level that becomes important. Ask your company to be an observer. Ask people you know if you can observe boardrooms. There are opportunities for those types of situations that I think are far better than a classroom, and certainly better than a classroom just for women.
Yeah, I'm totally there with you on this.
Well, I think that was an effort to open the doors so that women could say that they education, but I get that, men can get the job whenever they want, whenever they're asked. They don't think they need to be prepared. It's actually quite similar to how women interview for almost any kind of job. They always point out what they aren't perfect at, and men assume that if they're good at 80, 60, 50, 80, whatever, put a number there, that they can do the rest of it. And so I've watched colleagues and friends go through this.
So
Well,
Laurie,
that's the point
Laurie
of
building on that,
Yeah.
Laurie, building on that, I would say that one of the things to think about is it's a job. So what's your value proposition? Tell your story like that. I think that's important to be able to do that. So being trained from a class perspective, being trained about thinking about more broadly about being a board member. Here's what the role is. Here's what I bring to the table. Here's how boards should operate. Sure, that's helpful. That's helpful to do.
I think, to be fair, right, I think the classrooms, just to be a little bit balanced about my sentiments for this, I do think the classrooms have been successful for individuals, right? I think that people who have done Boardroom Ready have had good success getting into board seats coming out of that, because there's been a commitment to do so. And that is great for the individual. My point is more for women at large. I believe there's a conflict in that type of approach. So I do think for the individual, it can be valuable. And there's been examples of that. And I know plenty of women who've gone through that program who speak very highly of it. I just think it's a long-term problem for women if we start to build a coursework, gating item into how we get onto boards. That's what concerns me.
Okay. We've had a couple questions come in. One of them that we were not going to be asking, but I'd like to ask Laura if you can answer it. How are the California laws for women and now racial diversity on boards affecting how your fellow board members view you? Do you feel resentment or backlash, or is it being embraced?
For my current board, I think for my current boards, it means nothing. Right? I already have whatever respect or not from each of those roles. It does change the conversation, though, for the nominating governance and we actually need to pay attention to this, which has been terrific, because we've now needed to talk about how do we open the aperture. So not have these standard 5 criteria. It has to be a sitting CEO and 2, 3, but to talk about the skills and to force our recruiters to have do more work. And we actually, so it's down at making people get less comfortable with the current system of finding board members.
Yeah, Laura, I would totally agree. I don't think it's impacted the boards I sit on. I've also been cautious on California companies that have reached out. First of all, that's a long haul, not right now, but when you're normally traveling back and forth. I have had a California board before, and it was, it's a 3-day trip, right, to go back and forth. And that's a lot when I feel like I can be committing to other things during that time. So I've been cautious. And since the new legislation, my view is that I shouldn't be taking those seats. Those seats, I think, are more available for people who are up and coming, and I want to make sure I leave those seats available to them. I think it's changed the dialogue, which is for the positive. I'm not a huge quota fan either, to be honest, but because I think it can lead to resentment in the boardroom and in different places. But in general, I think it's net positive because it's forced nom-gov committees all over the country. I mean, we saw this in Europe as well, right before California. It's forcing us to have these conversations that have needed to take place for a long time or have fallen on deaf ears that many of us have taken into the boardroom. So I think it's pushing the issue to get ahead of it. And I know the boards where I'm on nom-gov, that's a conversation we're having of it's not a law here, but we're going to get ahead of it before it is. And let's make sure we're thinking about diversity of the slate anytime we're looking at one of these, in any of these positions.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it's been actually incredibly helpful. I mean, I'm not a quota fan either, but at some point you just have to force change. And actually this is forcing change, honestly. On the 3 boards that I sit on, the public boards, we're solely focused on diverse candidates right now. And that is just completely a new way to approach filling board seats. Yes, we're looking at the competencies first, and then we're solely looking at diverse candidates. So, whatever you feel about quotas, it's working.
We have questions coming in like crazy.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask a couple of the ones that came in just so that we can make sure we've covered in enough detail on some of the things we did before. Not during a crisis, about how much time do you spend with the CEO, other board members, and other teams? Just a ballpark. I think people
I mean, it depends on the board and it depends on the role. As a seated CEO, and it depends on the CEO if they're looking for it, I tend to be an ear often to CEOs when I'm on the board. And so I make myself available for conversations throughout the week, throughout the month. Just small things that are coming up, board structure, thinking about board meetings over time. This is what I was thinking. I'm often the first person people come to have those conversations. So I would say you've got your quarterly board meeting, you've got prep sessions that you'll have with the CEO, there's discussions with the board members. Public company is much heavier lift with all the committee work. If you end up on the audit committee, the short stick, that's the one that takes the most time.
Please.
Because of the time commitment, but so those can be a lot of work. Those can be a lot of work and a lot of prep time. If you're on the audit committee, you're reading all the filings of a public company and you're responsible for those. That's a lot of work. So it's hard to quantify it because I think it depends on the committees. But
definitely what. Hint, hint, don't volunteer for the audit committee if they
Hey,
ask.
As an audit committee chair, please, I want audit committee members.
I'm on all my audit committees, so I am sitting there, but it is a time commitment.
Usually the last one in gets on the audit committee, unfortunately.
Totally.
Okay. Another good question, which I'm going to combine two of them. Good board versus bad board members. What's the bad board member behavior?
The one that stands out to me,
evaluate it ahead of time.
Yeah, I think the one that stands out to me is the people that don't recognize the responsibility of the board versus the responsibility of management, and that overreach into management topics, which frankly CEOs, seated CEO board members tend to be the worst at this because we're used to jumping in and fixing the problem, right? That's kind of what we do in our own companies, and learning to toggle that back. I've certainly been, I've done this on my own, and I've had to learn to pull back because it's not your responsibility, is not to be management. And so I think the bad behavior often is that overreach.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also think that people who dominate in the room, right? So you can wind up with one or two people who dominate, and the chairman or the CEO's got to control that. Yep. And sometimes you need help.
Yep.
My pet peeve is the pontificators. So the folks who can say the same thing in 30 seconds have to talk for about 15.
Yeah.
Okay. And how will you evaluate that before? Do you interview with each one of the board members to evaluate that? It's hard to see that before you get into the room.
Oh, typically, but they're not going to say it about themselves. I think you have to talk to the CEO and ask, how does the boardroom dynamic work? Tell me about this person in the boardroom. Tell me about that person in the boardroom. And there's always personality that plays into that, but it's deciding if that's the type of boardroom you want to be in.
Mm-hmm.
I always ask the CEO, like, who do you go to for this question? Who's your buddy for that piece of it here? And what happens in the room? What could you wish would be different? Just to try and engage enough conversation so that you can suss that out.
Okay.
You can also ask about, board culture. What is the board culture? Oftentimes it mimics the company's culture because you have a lot of the same people involved, but you often, it's very illuminating to hear the response to that question.
And will you get an honest and accurate answer when you ask that question?
I think I have so far, yes. Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
There are also a couple other questions around how boards source new candidates. What type of a target do you come up with for a new role? Do you want a sitting CEO, board members? Do you go to search firms? How does that work?
It comes down to a gap analysis. Typically,
Right.
You use your lawyers. They have these lovely little spreadsheets, and you do an inventory of everybody on the board who has skill sets wherever. And the gaps come out, right? It's clear what you're missing: financial expertise, or CEO experience, or deep clinical medical experience. All of those different things: R&D experience, research experience, and you start to look at how you frame up and build the board over time. To meet those different needs. And so I've had the experience of doing it that way. You can then work with a search firm. They can also do this type of an inventory to think about it. But I find it's better when you just do that within the nom-gov committee, and then you start to target the types of roles you're looking for.
Okay.
I try and do it during we're in strategy session mode right now at board meetings. And we talk about, okay, if this is going to be our 5 and 10 year strategy, let's look at ourselves and say, oh, we want to go into this area. Are there any areas of expertise? As a way to relook at that gap analysis.
Great point.
And it's an easier way to have that conversation as opposed to saying, well, what don't we have? And so we go through, if we're going to go into this area, do we need different expertise?
One thing that I know, you spend some time doing Halley, and there's a question that relates to it. What strategies do you recommend for networking into a board position? How do you find these opportunities or allow these opportunities to find us? That's a very common question I get.
It's a really good question. I think it starts with being a little bit introspective. And again, sort of where I started this conversation about understanding your actual value proposition. Once you really understand that about yourselves and can articulate it, then I think you need to go to, well, who has seen those qualities in action? And those are the folks that I would lean on in terms of getting support and help for a first board position. You want people to put their hands up and say, yes, I've seen this person do exactly that, and they're great at it. And I think, you know, for folks who are really looking for their first position, you should look internally at your own companies, your management teams and your own boards, because those are the folks that can help you and they've seen you in action. I also think sort of getting out of your functional area and sort of networking in different zones. So about 5 years back, I realized I was going to all these lawyer events and I knew everyone and I loved everyone and it was super fun. But in terms of broadening my relationships, it wasn't doing a lot for me. And with limited time that I think most women have, and work and family conflicts, you know, you have to be really discreet about how you use your personal time. So I think you need to look outside for different sources of networking. So I think things like mass bio events, you know, other industry related events where you are going to meet people who are not in your current zone of influence.
Great advice.
Laura, any other advice there?
No, I think Haley's got it right on.
How about conflicts of interest? Have you seen how people manage the inevitable conflicts of interest that sometimes are brought to?
Let's talk about private companies for that. We specialize in conflict of interest in private companies. So it's really different. I spent a lot of years in ventures, so it's really different making that transition from private to public. Because in private companies, you're used to doing deals, figuring it out, resorting. And in public companies, this is a non-starter. It's actually a pretty big issue as companies move from private to public to change behavior. I'm sure that Halley's got some experience in that.
Sorry, Laurie, what was the question? Was there a question?
No, I was just saying that I'm sure you've lived the world between private to public.
Oh, yeah, a few times.
Okay. Are there actually organizations that women can join to expand their networks, specifically for boards? I've been hearing about New England Directors Association or something like that. Have any of you got any experience with that? I forget the name of it.
Biodirectors, and Halley
Biodirectors
formed it, so we should let Halley answer that one.
Right.
No, I had a little internet instability, so I've lost all of my poise is gone. Sorry about that.
I think there are lots of groups springing up almost daily, it seems, you know, focused on various aspects of diversity. The group that Jodie and I have been a part of for a long time is called Biodirector, and the goal with that group was really to enhance diverse candidates' board careers. And I think there's a question on this in the queue. With sort of how to get women into leadership roles on boards so that you're actually in a position to influence the people who are coming onto the board next. So it's one of the reasons I actually wanted the 2 Nom and Gov committee chair roles that I currently have. So I would like to be front and center on helping to evolve the demographics on my current boards. And I do think it's really critical for women to be taking more chair roles as well as being in leadership positions. So I wasn't answering your question specifically about Biodirector, but that was, you know, I do think it's an important topic that women who are already in the boardroom should be thinking about. How do you manage your board career to get yourselves into those positions to help other women and diverse candidates? Biodirector is just one group of many. I think you just have to do a Google search and you'll find about 20 more.
Yeah, Ellen's put a couple of them into the chat room already for us.
And I think looking for networking opportunities. I mean, get on the distribution for Goodwin or Wilmer Hale, and they aren't just lawyer events. They have events that are targeting broad biotech sector, and make sure you find yourself in those as well, where you can actually be intersecting across not just your company, not just your sector, but across the biotech sector in general. I think that's a key part of it. I think biodirector has been great. I think one of the things that I learned in that early on that I hadn't been thinking about on the boards I was on was getting on NomGov, right? And targeting being on NomGov and sharing NomGov so you can drive that conversation. I think that's a critical part of it, and driving towards more board chairs for women as well, I think is an important thing. That's going to take longer, but I think we're starting to see some headway, but it's going to take time.
Yeah, and an important part is where are other places you can go. So when I think about it, as a trade association you can be involved in, investors in your company, if you've got venture investors or public ones, you go and you say this is what you're interested in and get some help there. Network that way.
Also talking to if you're not a CEO, right? Talking to your CEO about their network and saying, hey, if you hear of anything where they're looking for somebody like me, this is what I think I could bring, and putting yourself out there. I actually push my executives to think about board seats as well. They haven't taken me up on it yet, but I've been encouraging them to think about it because I think it's really important. I've learned more being on boards that's helped me refine being a CEO than I ever expected. And I think that's really true for CMO types when they sit on boards and they see another CMO presenting and dealing with challenges or how they're presenting SAEs and things that occur in a program. They learn a lot sitting in those seats. And so for those of us that are CEOs, I think we really should be pushing and encouraging people within our organizations to go get that experience.
I agree with that. And I've also been asking in all my companies, I've been asking the CEO to point out the women that he, for all of them, thinks should be developed and get them a board seat and make that part of the CEO's objectives to develop the individual. And that's worked for two of mine. I've been pretty impressed. I wasn't sure it would work, but I thought, what the heck, give it a try.
That's actually how I got my first board role too, Laura. It was my CEO asked me to do it for professional development. And I kind of laughed at him at the time and said, how am I going to do that? I'm a woman who's a lawyer. And, to his credit, he put the mission out to our Ironwood board at the time, and it happened that way. So I think, for folks who aren't CEOs, ask for your CEO's help. I think more times than not, they'll be willing to do it.
Any advice for a first-time female CEO with science in her background to build her board?
To build her board or build her board experience?
Board. Oh, well, this is what it says, build her board. I can't interpret, I can only read.
All right, we'll take that as building out your board, right? I like to build out my board to reflect areas I'm not an expert in, right? I like to bring in skill sets around the board table that don't just match my own. I'm not looking for somebody to agree with the things I'm doing. I'm actually looking for a board of advisors on my board who can evaluate the strategies we're putting together from a different lens and give us that 10,000 foot view in a way that we're not going to do on the inside. So I don't want my board to reflect the management team. I want them to be more broad than that and more experienced than that and be able to complement what we're doing as a team.
Okay. Anybody else? This has actually been a really interesting panel because there hasn't been any reference to being the only or a minority on a board. Have you encountered bad behavior among the men on boards? And if so, how have you dealt with it? I'm kind of covering.
I have not. I have to say I have not. I've had great experience with the people that I've worked with on boards, and it's been very, very favorable for me, whether I'm the only or whether I'm one of many.
I haven't had any issues there. I think part of it is just because, as I said, I grew up in the tech industry, and by the time I got to the boards, behavior seemed totally fine compared to what I'd seen in the business side of it. So my antenna was probably not up very well.
For me, I think it's been that I think folks are just like overly polite. Maybe overly differential to the first woman on the board, and that is actually equally annoying to me than if there was some bad behavior. So I just, I think it gets a lot better over time, but that's been sort of my initial experiences as the only woman in the boardroom. It's like, oh, give that person the floor, make sure you're, not cursing and be super polite. And, I just wish people would just be themselves.
But it seems like maybe they've swung a little bit too far in trying to be good male board members.
Yes. Yeah. That's been my experience a little bit.
That's a big, I mean, and I've heard from others that that's not the case in everyone. So maybe the three of you are you just happen to be really in good situations. But I've heard everybody hears the horror stories after a few glasses of wine. But luckily you guys don't seem to have any that you would be actively remembering. Another question, which I've also thought of, is does a nonprofit, kind of like an institute, museum of science or something, does that help you get to a for-profit company, a corporate board? What do you think about that?
I think there's value, right, it depends on if the structure is like traditional board structure, right? Or is it just kind of a committee? I think it depends on, if talking about Museum of Science or the Museum of Fine Arts or, certain places it's probably different. I think many like prep school boards do not function like a board of directors of a company, right? But if you can learn kind of structure and governance through that, I think it can be valuable, right? I think that could be valuable. But I think it's also, you have to be careful because I think it doesn't necessarily bridge the gap necessarily, in my view.
Okay.
I don't know what others think.
Anybody else?
I was just going to say, I think if you're going to do a nonprofit board, I would just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons and that it's something that you actually deeply care about versus just trying to use it as a stepping stone, because it probably won't be a stepping stone. So it should just be something you want to do for you. And, there may be some advantages in future board work if the right people are around the table with you and get to see you in action in that setting. That can be helpful. But I overall, my overall feeling about nonprofits is do it because you want to, not because it's a stepping stone for something else.
My last big question, and then I'll try and see if there's anybody who has any other small questions. Is, if this is such a, if it's such a value to have a woman on a biotech board, why is this struggle? Why is this still such a struggle for our industry? What do you think it is?
Who wants to go first? I'll go. I feel like I'm going first all the time. I'm trying to regulate myself, right? Like you do in the corporate. But I think that I think it isn't just about having women on boards. It's about having diversity on boards. Full stop. It really. I think there is value to diversity of thought and diversity of experience, and there is no doubt that women and men have different experiences. I think that's critical. I think a key part of it is that our traditional mold for how we pick board members is based on a particular set of skills that we're lacking diversity in when we look at the level down, at the executive level. We talked about it earlier, right? There aren't enough executives that are women or are diverse to then fill those slates as we go up. So we need to get more creative because we are lacking the diversity of thought. I mean, how many breast cancer companies have only men, right? Their really? That's a problem. You're not thinking like a patient. You can't tell me you are. Those are the things we need to be thinking about. That diversity of thought brings in a very different perspective for our patients, for our customers, and for our leadership teams. And I think it's critical that we try to mirror that at a board level over time. But it's tricky. And I think it's because the executive level is still lacking. And that's been our traditional, pool to pull from.
I think that's totally right, because we've had rigid criteria, which we've been comfortable with. And then we've looked for people we're comfortable with. And both of those things go against increasing the pool. And the concept of diversity in thought is incredibly important. It's uncomfortable. And that's one of the things as well. People have to sign up for the fact that you will get a better outcome because you're having diverse. It's like for one of my boards, we're trying to get someone who is younger. Now that was an interesting conversation. What is younger? Well, when you're talking to a board where, I was the youngest on the board, which is a shock to me. And I went through like somebody who's 40s. Oh my God, could you even do that? Really, we're facing the consumer. Don't you think we need to have somebody who actually is in that age group? And it's that kind of you have to look at your business and to tie it to the business. And we were successful in doing that, but the pitch at the board level was the diversity was age. was, well, what am I going to talk to about someone in their 40s? Well, how about the company? How about the industry? Right?
But do you think that people who are not in an executive position already, who are in their 40s, would you think that they would even consider that this would be something that they would either be interested in, find value with, or be eligible for?
Well, if they're not in an executive position, the answer to that is no.
Right.
So I agree with that. But there are plenty of successful executives in their 40s who I think could definitely, to Jodie's point, it adds to your career. It adds to your profile. I firmly believe you're a better executive having sat in the boardroom.
Okay. How do we build those mid-level to executive level people to fertilize the ground for future board members? How do we do that? How do you each do that? Or how have you seen it done?
So
Halley.
personally, yeah, Halley, why don't you start? I keep starting. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, so personally, I think it's just having a voice and decisions like promotions, right? And making sure that folks who may not be as extroverted as some of the guys on the team are still getting the proper respect and visibility. And so I think it's women who are already in executive positions really need to be looking out for others, and need to be raising their voice and pointing out when there's situations of unconscious bias, especially when it comes to sort of performance evaluations and promotions, and highlighting those discrepancies, because if we don't do it, it's unlikely that anyone will. So at least at Ironwood, when I joined this company 12 years ago, I was the only woman at the VP level, and it was my mission from day one to not have that enduring legacy. And we dramatically changed it over time by creating sort of some subcommittees of women leaders, and then the folks like me who are already with a seat at the table would constantly remind folks that we need to be looking at different behaviors and valuing the way that people communicate differently in certain situations, and just highlighting the need to evaluate people differently.
Mentoring is important. So that's what you're talking about here. So mentoring, as I said earlier in my boards, I am challenging the CEO to show me a development plan for your next level and the skip level. So 2 levels. And on the development plan, I want to see something that supports that.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think anybody that knows me knows I'm a huge I believe firmly that we have to bring people with us, that it is our obligation as the people who have these opportunities afforded to us or earned them, to bring people along. And so looking within our companies, looking within our industry, making ourselves available for questions, I think we have an absolute obligation to do that, whether it's through panels like this or one-on-one. And I think that's the only way it's going to change. I mean, I look back at the early part of my career, it was all men that were my mentors. And so there was a question in the chat about, where did men fit in this? In my career, men played a huge role in bringing me forward. And so it isn't just the women that need to bring the women along. It's both. We have to make this a square both effort. We, like men and women, non-binary, we all have to join arms and say, we're going to figure out how to fix the diversity issue. Full stop. And our companies will be better for it. And if we don't, right, at the executive level, at the board level, we're going to run out of people, right? Cambridge is building companies left and right. We don't have enough people. So we can't afford to keep cutting back on our pool. And so to be successful as an industry, to keep Boston in the #1 position it's in right now, we have to put ourselves to work in this way. That's my firm belief.
And I believe expanding the conversation for diversity, as we're having today, is better for women. It's better for everyone.
Totally.
So just expanding the conversation, we have to look for people of color, people of different experiences. I love it. That expands the opportunities for everyone.
Do each of you take people under your wing and let them shadow you or be mentored by you? That was a direct question from somebody, so be careful with your answer.
Yeah, mentoring, absolutely. Shadowing is challenging at times, given what goes on within a company at times, right? There can be times where that's appropriate. Within the company, shadowing is a lot easier than shadowing somebody
Right.
when you're not in the company. But from a mentorship, you can define it 15 different ways, right? Is it a coffee every once in a while? Is it a full-blown mentorship relationship? Certainly have examples of that. And as much as I can fit that in, I try to do it.
Well, and just from my own perspective, mentoring is not something where someone follows you around. They reach out to you and they ask you for something specific. And it doesn't take a huge amount of time, but the onus is on the person who's asking to know exactly what it is they're looking for and to be very careful with the use of the time of the person they're asking to mentor them. So there are great mentees and not great mentees, and that would be a tip for anyone who wants to be in that role. We have about 6 minutes left. Any other burning thoughts that you have or insights that you give this group? Because clearly there are a lot of people who are really looking for the nuts and bolts of how do you get into this role.
Well, I would say be brave. I would say
how much time does it take? Is it way more than you ever thought? Or oh, sorry,
Lost you there, Laurie.
I would say be brave, right? Talk to people. Ask
yeah,
for
I'm
it.
just trying to
Put yourself out there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think, and we talked about this a little bit throughout it, but I think as women, and the original book by Sheryl Sandberg spoke to this, right? And Laurie, you mentioned it early on, Halley's mentioned it a couple times. There is this tendency in women to second guess ourselves, to think we need 100% of the skills to do things. Imposter syndrome, deference in the boardroom, quietness in the boardroom, introvert versus extrovert, all of that plays into it. You have to be yourself. To be successful, you have to be yourself, and you have to own what you're good at. And I think as women, we sometimes can be our worst enemies. I think we have to own the fact that we belong in the boardroom and bring those skill sets to bear. So don't be afraid to do that. You know what you're good at, and make that work for you. That would be my advice.
And I would just add to that, and don't be afraid to ask people for help, especially the people who know you really best. So with that, unfortunately, I have to say goodbye because I'm running to another Zoom call. But thank you very much for having me.
Happy Zooming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Laurie, for putting all this together.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
It's fun.
I apologize. I got a little flaky on the internet in the last few minutes, but I think since Halley had to leave a couple minutes early, I think this would be a good time to say thanks so much to both of you. I don't want to lose my internet again. I really appreciate your input, and thanks for volunteering to do this. This will be recorded.
Take care.
Any of you who want to check it out again, and thanks to Jeff and the team at Locust Walk for inviting us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.